Okay, let's talk about the Redshift render view. So we'll go ahead and start up here in the top left of the render view. We've got the start and stop IPR button. So if we hit that, we'll see that we start progressive rendering. To the right of that button, we have the refresh IPR button, which is just going to reload the scene. Over to the left, we have the actual render button. So when we hit the render button, it's going to show us a full resolution render as well as our final bucket render. So let's flip back live IPR. Next, let's talk about these percentages over here on the right-hand top side of the IPR. So the percentage on the right-hand side is actually the percentage of your final resolution. So right now, because my final resolution is 1280 by 720, when we're set to 50%, Redshift is only actually calculating 640 by 320. So right now, my final resolution is 1280 by 720, which means right now in the IPR, we're rendering 50% of that, which is 640 by 360. And this can be very useful if you're doing look development and, want to fit your entire frame into a smaller region and not calculate the entire frame. Maybe you're adjusting lighting or something, and we don't need to see precisely the final pixels. We can get a much faster result by looking at just a fraction of the final render resolution. Now, conversely, we have this percentage on the left, which is scaling the image after it's rendered. So if I set this percentage to 200, for example, you'll see that we're zooming in on the 640 by 360 image. We can also use the middle mouse button to do the zooming. Now, this is the functionality of these percentages under the fixed scaling option. We also have the original size option, which is going to render our full 1280 by 720 render and then scale that rendered image by the percentage that's displayed. So if I type in 100%, you'll see we're actually rendering our full resolution image. We also have fit window, which is going to scale your render resolution by the height and the width of your window, and then you can zoom in and out of that. As well, we have fill window, which is going to scale your final resolution by the width of your window. So notice how, as I'm dragging the height up and down, the resolution isn't changing. However, if I scale my window in horizontally, the render resolution changes. I personally prefer to use fixed scaling because then I have individual control over exactly how much of my image is being rendered, and I still have the option to zoom in and inspect individual pixels. Okay, let's move over to our render passes dialog. So if we have a bunch of AOVs set up, you can click this drop down and actually take a look at exactly what your AOVs are outputting. So for example, if I want to take a look at my diffuse lighting only, or if I want to take a look at one of my light groups, or any of the other AOVs that I've set up. This can be really useful for when you're optimizing your render for a production render, because you'll be able to solo out lights or direct passes to help evaluate where your grain is coming from. All right, next up is channels. Let's just throw a quick color on our background so we can see what's going on here. So channels lets me look at red, green, and blue, as well as alpha separately. So if we take a look at red, we'll see our red values mapped from 0 to 1. Same with green and blue, as well as our image alpha. Let's flip on back. This little pixely icon allows you to show your output prior to the denoising if you have optics denoising enabled. Right now it's grayed out because I'm not using optics. To the right of that, we have our render region, which is super useful. This allows us to only render the region that is selected. Super handy in case you need to tweak a material and you only need to update this piece of the window. It will render significantly faster since it does not have to think about all of the pixels outside of the render region. This is a case where setting our IPR render resolution to 100 would be super useful. And I'm also going to call out some shortcuts here that really help as well. So if we hold down Shift and left click, we can actually drag to select our region size. If we hit Control F, it's going to frame up the region size. And once we're here, if we press F, it will frame up our entire render. All right, so let's go ahead and set these guys back. And lastly, if we want to disable the render region, we can press R. As well, R will bring the render region back. All right, next up we have our camera selection. So in this case, we have 3 cameras in the scene, but it also gives me a front perspective right and top option in case you want to analyze your scene from any of these orthographic views. In my case, I do not. So we'll flip back to auto, which is going to default to the camera that I am looking through. Now, if I were to untick my current camera, you're going to see that Redshift updates to wherever my editor camera is. But let's say I want to continue looking through camera 2 here. So let's frame it up with camera 2 real quick and press the next button, which is lock camera. So this will lock down our render view to the camera that we're looking through at the time that we press the lock button. So now if I deselect that camera, you can see I can freely move around, do whatever I want, and our IPR camera stays locked off. Let's go ahead and look back through that camera. Next up is the bucket rendering button. If I press that guy, it's going to start rendering with my final render settings in bucket render mode. If I unlock my camera and move it, you'll get kind of a sense that this is much slower and maybe not the way that you want to function in your look development process, but can be really useful if you are tweaking your final production render. This works with the render region as well. Just going to disable that for a second, get our frame back, re-enable bucket rendering, press R again, and you can see that we are getting our final render in the region, which is also quite cool and super useful. Let's go ahead and disable that. To the right of bucket rendering is freeze tessellation, and this can be super useful if you are making updates in your scene and you don't want to be constantly changing the tessellation or updating the subdivision of your objects because it's really slowing you down. This button will freeze the tessellation through your updates. To the right of freeze tessellation are a few different render mode options. So you can see this circle with a hole in the middle of it is our regular render. If I click on clay, you'll see that we are now getting essentially a material override, which can be really useful for initially denoising your lights or diagnosing light samples. Also, if you're getting texture errors or something like that, if you flip to clay rendering mode, it can sometimes help you make sure that it's just a texture error, not geometry error. And lastly, we have samples, which is super useful. In this scene, it's not, I don't have it set up. And lastly, we have sample mode, which is going to flip us into bucket rendering and perform our final render. And this is going to let you see where your samples are being used the most. So darker colors represent lower amounts of sampling, and lighter colors represent your maximum sample value. And this just really helps give you a picture, literally, of the work that the adaptive sampler is doing on your scene. Let's flip back to regular, turn bucket mode off. Lastly, we have our snapshot options. So this image icon, if I click it, you'll see it gives us this empty bar, and this will hold a number of snapshots as you take them. And as you click on them, maybe let's delete these, change our camera, take another snappy, and then we can go and display various changes or comparisons or whatever you might need snapshots for. Flip back into our camera. We also have send the current image to picture viewer, which can also be useful for the same purposes, just instead it displays it through the picture viewer for you. So maybe we want to compare our final render to a clay render where we are taking a look at our light samples or whatever you might need. All right, we'll flip back into regular. Now under File in the top left, we have the option to save to various different image types as well as multi-layer EXR. Under the View menu, we have most of the shortcuts that I just talked about, but down here at the bottom we have IPR undersampling, which is super useful in case you are adjusting lights or maybe moving your camera around. Basically, this guy is just going to say, give us a super low resolution version right as soon as you can so that we can kind of see the changes that we're doing as live as possible. And if I compare this to no IPR undersampling, you'll see as I move around, my images are less grainy, but also much less frequent to update. pop back into the camera again. Zoom, we already went over zoom. Rotation's kind of cool because we can do some image flipping. So for example, if I press 8, it's just going to flip my canvas horizontally, which can be super useful for just checking yourself against what you've gotten used to seeing in your image versus kind of seeing the image fresh from a different perspective. Can be pretty useful. We also have flip vertical, which is the V shortcut. And then of course we have, rotations as well. All right. Thanks for